Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows, and here's the first half of one of my new American Montage interviews. I first heard Ed decades ago, and then I heard him again when I lived in Washington, D.C., but those are two stories we'll get into later, along with how Ed conquered his blindness to get to the pinnacle of broadcasting. But first, I wanted to talk about old-time radio. Ed does a show every week in the nation's capital and talks about old-time radio. I do a show every week about old-time radio. The first thing I mentioned to Ed is that radio is very different from television. You can't see radio, of course, and that's why they have to add extra things sometimes into the script so you don't get lost.
And you notice how they write on radio, guys talking on the telephone to somebody, and all of a sudden he stops and he says, "Wait a minute, you!" And then the gun goes off and he shoots him. I mean, they telegraphed everything. Like on Dragnet, here are the stairs, here's the elevator. I mean, you could envision that with good sound effects, but they didn't leave anything to chance. They wrote in a special way, and the actors were specially trained, I guess, to be consummate actors for radio. I don't know how good they'd be on the stage, but they could sure read a script.
And of course, Ed, we have Jack Webb to thank for so many things, but some of those people who did yeoman's work in radio, for example, Jack Crucian, Virginia Gregg, people such as that, we wouldn't know what they looked like had Webb not put them in Dragnet. He brought all his old radio friends into the Dragnet show on television.
Right.
And when Webb was criticized by NBC, which wanted him to use more familiar faces, he said when a policeman knocks on a door, Tab Hunter is not necessarily going to be on the other side of that door. So it's great fun to watch those old Dragnet TV episodes and say, oh, look, there's John Daner or Parley Bear, both of whom would, of course, be in a lot of other shows later, but these were, by and large, familiar voices who were not familiar faces.
Yeah.
So we really owe a debt to Jack Webb.
That's right. Well, Harry Morgan, who was Friday's partner in the later edition of Dragnet, was on radio with Jack Webb in the early years, and Webb was very loyal to his actors. The actors he liked, he used over and over again, whether they be on radio or television, and that paid off for him.
And many of those actors who now may have unfamiliar names, Forrest Lewis, Herb Vigran, people such as that, they were called on a lot.
Yep.
And I think one of the remarkable things about these radio actors was their stamina. I mean, today a show will do 12 episodes a year on television. They did 39 fresh shows a year, one a week, live every week. And in my listening to thousands of hours of network radio, I have seldom heard anybody who was a no-shower. I guess I've seldom not heard someone not show up. Is that what I meant to say?
Yeah, if it did, they'd get a substitute, unless it was, and they wouldn't even mention it unless it was the headliner. I've heard on the Lux Radio Theater, filling in for so-and-so is, and I can't remember the names, but a lot of those journeyman actors like John Daner and Harry Bartell, those guys that were on Gunsmoke every week. Norman Macdonald had his own stable of actors, and if you listen to that show regularly, you'd hear the same guys in different roles every week.
Well, John Daner was one of my favorite actors. He could play a minister or a senator one week and the next week be the nastiest, most ill-educated person in the world.
Yep.
And as we listen to those recordings today, in hindsight, it's really interesting how a very small group of actors really were on the air every week, but sometimes playing radically different characters,
right,
and often playing incredibly different types.
And the thing about Gunsmoke, I'm on the subject, they let some of the actors be writers. Some shows were written by Vic Perrin, and some shows were written by the sound man, Ray Kemper. I know he had a name credit on a couple of them, and Norman Macdonald was good enough to let them do the shows, to write the shows. As a matter of fact, he wrote several himself. Of course, the main writer on that series was John Meston.
And what a debt we owe to him.
Who was a fabulous writer.
One of the most remarkable things about Gunsmoke, and the great late Harry Bartell told me one time, is that the guys and gals who did that weekly radio show did it with very, very little rehearsal.
Oh, yeah, they had a table read on Saturday. They called it Dirty Saturdays. When they'd sit around, have coffee in Danish, and do the read-throughs, and somebody would come up with an obscene or suggestive story, and then we'd go from there. And they would record one show, then break for lunch, and come back and do another one half the time.
And, of course, Gunsmoke was born in the era right after World War II, Ed, and we knew about magnetic recording then, and that meant that this was among the first major radio shows, primetime radio shows, that were not done live.
True. I know that the sound men on the show, if you read that book on Gunsmoke, on their own, they took a Saturday, took a tape recorder, and went to William Conrad's home. I guess he lived in the valley someplace. And they went out in the fields and recorded various guns and put them on what they had in those days called a Mackenzie machine.
In order to selectively fire them off.
You could punch it up and get Matt's gun, Chester's gun, something like that. Because the guns that they were using with the blanks would overload the sound system, and they didn't sound like real guns on the air.
You know, Ed, it was not that long ago that we lost one of the driving forces in network radio, and that was Norman Corwin. He was 101, but still it was a great loss.
Yeah.
Well, I feel very fortunate because I first met Norman in 1967 when he was guest lecturing at Indiana University. He went into a studio with a microphone, put us in another room where we could not see him, but only hear what was happening. He went in, fired off some gunshots, and then had us come in and try to find the gun, and we couldn't. There was nothing in the room we figured could make a gunshot. Then he took off his belt, his leather belt, and thwacked it on a couch, and over the mic, that sounded like a gun.
To simulate the sound.
And no matter how funny it may look in the studio, the question is, does it sound right at home?
Well, it's gotten better. I remember if you hear one of the early Lone Ranger shows from 1938 or something, when Grazer was the Lone Ranger, before he died in an automobile accident, the announcer was Brace Beamer, who later became the Lone Ranger. Anyway, when you hear the beginning of the show, they have gunshots. It sounded like a guy hitting a cereal box with a drumstick.
Yeah, I remember it was pretty darn hollow. It almost sounded like tom-toms.
So they didn't have any guns at all then either, and it was pale in significance to what it sounded like when they had recorded gunshots.
And, of course, with the advent of magnetic tape recording, where, as you say, they could go out and record real guns in proper fidelity, it allowed them to do something else, and that was to faithfully reproduce the sound of the ricochet, which they could not do when faking a gunshot. Sometimes that was pretty important to the plot.
Yeah.
And, you know, the golden days of radio, the golden age, and Corwin always said that it was the shortest golden age in history.
He's right.
Included a great amount of radio that came out of Chicago. Now, we think of New York and Los Angeles as centers of radio, theater, drama, and news, but until the modern era, Chicago was a genuine hub.
Yeah, the reason was, of course, they couldn't transmit from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast at that time, and Chicago was kind of a center. And as they were able to get the network to go from New York to L.A., then a lot of the shows moved to Los Angeles, Lum and Abner and Fibber and Molly, and a lot of those shows, and those people later became movie stars after a fashion. And so that's why Chicago was a very important center for radio back in the 30s, mainly.
Ed, let's change gears here for just a moment, change directions. There's one great comedian, wasn't based in Chicago, was on the East Coast, whom a lot of historians say really never got his due. Jack Benny said he was much funnier than Benny was, and that is, it's kind of a sad story. That's Fred Allen.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, Fred Allen always sounded as if he was holding his nose. As a matter of fact, that's the way Benny used to imitate him during that fake feud they had.
That's right.
Ed Walker, if you would then, put Fred Allen, his style, his radio shows over the year, put that unsung hero into perspective.
Well, he was ahead of his time, unfortunately. He was, you know, some people would refer to him as erudite, I guess. I mean, he didn't just... he wasn't like a comedian who just one joke after another. Allen was above that sort of thing. He did a lot of good stuff. In one of his books, Treadmill to Oblivion, I think, he was very ill toward the end of his life, and he said something. He said, "I live every day as though it were my last." and one day I'll be right. How about that?
And Jack Benny loved him, even though they had that fake feud going on.
Benny had a great cast, too. Phil Harris was great. Dennis Day was fabulous. And they used a lot of the same actors, too.
You know, I'm named for Dennis Day.
Oh, really?
Well, the story in my family goes that when my mother was pregnant with me right after World War II, her favorite radio show was the Jack Benny Show. And she and my dad argued over what to name me. Well, they realized that my last name would be Daly, and my mom loved Dennis Day. So they said, if he's a boy, we'll call him Dennis in honor of Dennis Day. And had I turned out to be a girl, I would have been named Doris in honor of Doris Day.
Doris Daly. You know how Dennis Day got the job as singer on that show, don't you?
Refresh my memory. Which story have you heard?
They wanted to hire Johnny Johnston, who had a hit record of Laura back in the 40s. And they had a cast call or rehearsal or something, and it was Dennis Day's turn to perform. And they said, Dennis Day? And he said, yes, please.
And I'm sure he did that with that boyish, impish kind of voice. I guess in doing that, he stood out all of a sudden.
And that tickled Mary, and she talked Benny into hiring Dennis as opposed to Johnny Johnston.
Well, the thing about Dennis Day, my namesake, or it's the other way around, who I think had 9 children or something in real life.
Oh, he did, yeah.
The thing about Dennis Day, Patrick McNulty, is that he began on the show as such a nebbish. They had Verna Felden play his mother, but they suddenly realized what a multifaceted guy this was. A singer who was a comedian who also could do a spot-on imitation of Churchill.
There's a Benny show, I don't know if you've heard it, where Benny did a lot with Ronald Coleman. Supposedly they were neighbors, and Dennis Day did a great Coleman, and they were doing Coleman and Day back and forth, and it was fabulous. I don't know what year that show was, but if you ever get a chance to hear it, you should listen to it.
My Lord, Coleman had such a great voice.
Yeah.
And when they pretended that Ronald Coleman and his wife were Benny's next-door neighbors, her name was Benita. If you remember, Jack always called her Benita.
Yeah.
And even though bringing Coleman and his wife onto one of the shows as Benny's neighbors might have originally been a one-shot idea, the idea of this incredibly straight-laced actor who did all these wonderful parts, it's a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done, that type of thing, they so clicked with the audience that the writers had to bring them back repeatedly.
Yeah, and they developed their own show as a result of that, the Halls of Ivy, which starred Ronald and Benita Coleman, and was created by the same guy who created Fibber McGee and Molly.
Good old multi-talented Donald Quinn.
Donald Quinn.
And some of what Quinn did is magnificent. I mean, there was such a wealth of good writing in old-time radio, but that's the way it had to be. You didn't have visuals. You had to rely strictly on the spoken word.
Absolutely. And I wish that that kind of talent existed today. I wish people had the vehicle to do old-time radio. I don't think it would go over anymore. I mean, they try to do it in the stereo. They tried that on National Public Radio for a while. They called it Earplay, I believe was the name of the show. And it just never, it didn't have the pizzazz of the old radio shows. Maybe it was past its time. I don't know. But all I know is I love the radio, and that's why I decided to go into it.
And we have a lot of other things we want to talk about. I had mentioned at the beginning of this show that you were born blind, but that has not stood in your way to becoming one of the best-loved radio personalities on the East Coast. I remember in an earlier interview, though, you telling me that as a young guy, you were in on a test of the widely used cane now that blind people use, but you were among the first to get to use it.
Yeah, it was after the war. We had a teacher at school who was the phys ed teacher, and he went into the Army. He later became an eye doctor. Dick Hoover was his name. And he came back to the school and talked to the superintendent and said, I've had a lot of success with blinded war veterans up at Valley Forge, teaching these guys how to use a long cane. Heretofore, the canes were just symbolic. They were white to signify that you couldn't see. So he developed this system with a long cane, and he came back and said, if I could test it with some of your older kids, I'd like to do it. And he said, yeah, sure. And this guy was amazing. He would lie down in the street, not a busy street. He'd dare you to hit him with your cane and not step on him. And then if you ever walked off a curb, he'd say, supposing that had been a 10-foot cliff, Doc. And I'd say, well, that makes you wonder a little bit. But he was tough, but he was good. And he, as I say, later became an eye surgeon. And we have the long cane technique attributed to Dick Hoover.
So initially, the canes that blind people used that had painted to signify that they couldn't see didn't really serve any purpose. They were just kind of a sign they were carrying.
That's right. Now they have canes that vary in length, and I think they say that the cane, when it's standing vertical, should come up to your breastbone. That's the signal that they use for the length of the cane, and you make an arc with it as you walk. As your left foot goes forward, the cane is in front of your right foot, and as your right foot goes forward, the cane is in front of your left foot, getting ready for the next step.
And Ed, I think from talking to you in the past, you had wonderful parents who put up with your youthful enthusiasm. You told me a story once about how your dad gave you a degree of freedom, but looked out for you. It's a wonderful story. Can you recount it for us?
I was in high school. There again, I just had that course with Dick Hoover in the cane system, and I had a girlfriend who lived on the other side of town in Northeast Washington. And I, at breakfast one day, told my parents, well, I'm going over and see Dottie today. And my mother said, oh, no, son, you can't do that. And my dad just said, let him go. And I said, thanks, Pop. So what I did not know until years later, my father followed me, let me get lost, make mistakes. He never offered to help me. He just wanted to be sure I didn't get hurt. But I thought that was a really great thing for a father to do for a son.
But your dad realized that he and your mother were going to have to let you out of the nest eventually.
That's right. And the other thing he did when we moved, when I was in college, we moved to a new house. Wasn't new, new to us. And they had a retaining wall in front. And one night my father found this boulder and put it in the corner of that retaining wall. He said, here's that rock, son. Now remember this. If you ever get off the wrong street or something, this could be your symbol to find out that you're at the right house. And sure enough, one night a cab driver let me off in the wrong block, and I was lost. And I turned around, listened for the direction of the traffic on Wisconsin Avenue, and I started walking back up, and it was a block later, I found that stone in the corner of that retaining wall, and I found my way home.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, Ed, you and I share a great love of radio. We wouldn't be talking to each other right now. I wouldn't be doing this show if I didn't love radio. And I think both of us developed a love of it by listening to those 50,000-watt long-distance stations at night. From rural Indiana, I could pick up KDKA in Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah.
And many of those Clear Channel, now not the company we talk about today that's Clear Channel, but they were called Clear Channel stations. Many of those stations could be heard over much of the U.S.
Yeah.
So in my case, I went away to college and had a mixed-up career over the years. But in your case, here you are, a young guy, fascinated with radio, but you're walking around with a cane because you're blind. I would assume it took a lot of work to get anybody at a radio station or even in school to believe that you could be a success with what they considered to be a handicap.
Oh, yeah. Nobody wanted to do that, and they used to laugh at me at school. Yeah, sure, kid. You know. And then when I went to American University, that's where I met Willard Scott, my freshman year there, and we hit it off very well. And we had a little campus radio station, and one of the guys there was a friend of Willard's too. He said, go in that studio. We had one of these Velocity microphones live on both sides. And he said, sit across the table and say something smart to Eddie and see what he does. He can't see anyway. So he did, and I retorted, and he retorted, and the Joy Boys were born. And, you don't just assign somebody to be your partner. You have to have a certain, what's the word I want?
There has to be a chemistry. There has to be a certain kind of rapport there.
Well, yeah, a certain rapport. Yeah, it is.
And I have always heard that if a pair works together, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, whatever, they begin to anticipate what the other is going to say, and the comedy sometimes becomes automatic.
Exactly. I could anticipate what Willard was going to say, and vice versa. And so that's how. And then we got a job at WOL, which was a 250-watt station then, on Sunday nights. And the program was called Going AWOL. And we did that $5 a show.
You guys finally hit big money. At least now you had enough cash to pay your bus fare.
Yeah. This was in 1952. And Willard, of course, was a staff announcer, but they had me come in and do that show on Sunday night. And that was the first experience I had for meager salary as it was, but at least I got on the air, and that's how it all began. Then when he moved over to NBC and went into the Navy, knew the draft was catching up with him. We had started the Joy Boys over there at WRC, and then Willard enlisted in the Navy, and I auditioned and got his afternoon record show, which started out as a 15-minute program at 5:45. And at that time, the soap operas were going off the air, right and left. The show that was 15 minutes when Willard had it ended up to be 4 hours by the time he came back from the Navy.
And I hope I'm correct in this, because you were working at a major market radio station, you didn't have to handle all the complex equipment.
No, but I have done that.
Which pretty much goes to show that you can do anything you put your mind to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, that was the beginning time of your long partnership with Willard Scott. You were known all over the East Coast as the Joy Boys. How did that partnership first begin to blossom then on radio?
Let's see. We were on from 4 to 6. And shortly after that, Willard got assigned to do television, the Bozo the Clown show. So we would just do a half hour of the Joy Boys. Then Willard would go up and do his television, and I had to do the rest of the show myself. And our show has been on various times of the day. For a while, we were on at 7:05 at night. We would tape it. And then they moved us in the evening from 8 to 11, I think it was, 8 to 11. And I thought that was kind of an insult because everybody was watching television by that time. And Willard, the smart man that he is, said, look at it this way. By the time we go on the air, they can't half hear the signal of the station at night, and most of the management people are drunk anyway by that time. So, and we got all day to do freelance work, which accounted for a lot of the commercials that we did back in the 60s. So it was a blessing in disguise.
Now, Ed, my first memories of putting a name with your voice was not during the many, many times I visited D.C., nor during the 20 years I lived there. It was earlier. I'm doing local radio as a kid in Indiana, and we ran what's called a public affairs show. You just ran it to fill time on weekend. You were the anchor for it. It was for a group even back then that was trying to get people to recycle. It was called Waste Not, Want Not.
Oh, yes, I used to do that show.
And if I'm not mistaken, one of the people you had on the show had this great mafia-sounding name, Rocco Patron.
I don't remember that name.
And I remember it came in on little reels of tape, and we ran it every weekend, Waste Not, Want Not, and that was the first time I heard your voice and knew your name.
Well, and that's very interesting. We was the kid about that show, and I said, we'll change the title. Call it Let's Talk Trash.
I love it. I love it.
Nobody bought that. So, but this show was heard middle of the night on Saturday and Sunday morning, and I didn't know anybody ever heard it.
But for some reason, we ran it on Saturday afternoon. So see, some people did hear it.
It was a 5-minute show, and it was, they had a producer and everything like that. And I must admit, I couldn't read it straight through without tape editing. That's one thing when you use print, you read ahead of yourself so that you can anticipate what's coming. In Braille, you don't have that luxury. So I had to read everything over a couple of times, and even then, I would have to do a lot of retakes. But they were very patient with me on that.
Oh, I thought it was a great little show. I look forward to hearing it every week. You know, there were so many of those public affairs shows. I remember one CBS did called The World of Religion. Douglas Edward anchored it live every, I think, Thursday afternoon. And I was at CBS in New York one time, and I was introduced to this woman named Isabel Lape. If it had been Ann Smith, I never would have remembered the name, but Isabel Lape, whose name I had heard in the credits. She produced The World of Religion. I said, hey, I'm from Indiana. We air your show. And she said, too bad nobody gets to hear it. I said, no, we air it Saturday afternoons at 4:30. I thought she was going to drop dead. We must have been the only station in America that actually aired all these wonderful shows when people were awake. But, living in Washington was an ideal place to be as an announcer because there were tons of government and military public affairs shows coming out of there every...
Yeah, with guest star, Stars for Defense, The Red Cross had shows.
Serenade in Blue.
Serenade in Blue.
And getting back to the Joy Boys, you and Willard both did funny voices and accents. You did the majority of them. And there was one character from Baltimore. And if no one listening has heard a Baltimore accent, you got to hear this. You called him Baltimore Benny.
Well, in Baltimore, of course, I'm having gone to school over there, they have a certain way of talking. And he talked like this, pal. How's everything? He didn't say everything, everything. And I remember one time I was in Baltimore, and I had a little thing, a mitt that I wore on my hand, and one side of it said bus, and you turn it over, and the other side said taxi. And you'd hold this thing up in the air if you had the right side, and a taxi would pull up eventually. And the guy pulls up one time. First time I used it, I had it in my hand about 30 seconds. Cab driver pulls up, opens the door. He says, how the hell where's that? Where'd you get that thing? And I said, well, I told him, what? Hop in, man. I never seen anything like that in my whole life.
And it's ironic that the main sound they mispronounce is the sound O. They say O. And, of course, the Oreos, the O's, that's the ball team there. So they're using that a lot.
Yeah, the O's, the Orioles, hey. And if you listen to the national anthem at an Orioles game, maybe you've heard it, when they get to the line, oh, say, does that Star Spangled Banner, they all go, oh, you know.
and they leave letters out. Now, in Baltimore, the word payment, P-A-Y-M-E-N-T, payment, is not something you put in the mail to a creditor.
Oh, yeah. That's the street. That's what you walk on, a payment. And Santa Claus comes down the chimney.
And there's a park there named for the Druids, but they can't say Druid properly.
Druid Hill Park, Drudel. And you go to the ocean. You don't go down to the ocean. You go down the ocean. If you're going to Ocean City. I'm going down the ocean.
The second half of this interview is also posted here on YouTube. I'm Dennis Daly.